One of the concerns with the US fracking boom has been the uh, problem of methane leakage in production of oil and gas. And so that has previously been estimated to be relatively high and be very impactful for the full life cycle assessment of greenhouse gas emissions by burning natural gas. And a recent study published in Geophysical Research Letters, Lan et al. 2019, now estimates significantly lower methane emissions from US oil and gas development. And the study was a collaboration between the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the University of Colorado at Boulder. And the authors looked at air samples downwind of 20 oil and gas development projects in the United States between 2006 and 2015. And I'll read a small part of the summary that they provide. Based on long-term and well-calibrated measurements, we find that 1, there's no large increase of total methane emissions in the United States in the past decade. 2, there's a modest increase in oil and gas methane emissions, but this increase is much lower than some previous studies suggest. And 3, the assumption of a time constant relationship between methane and ethane emissions has resulted in major overestimation of an oil and gas emissions trend in some previous studies. So essentially, when you look at the enormous production increase of oil and gas in America over the past decade, the modest increase in oil and gas methane emissions, of course, is quite surprising, because that means that the industry actually did a really good job in containing these emissions. And this is, of course, good news overall for the life cycle emissions assessment of every process that involves natural gas, and that's power generation, home heating, plastics manufacturing, vehicle fuel, and so on. So that's quite important for the U.S. economy today. But I think it also shows some important points about the general discussion of emissions. So one thing we can derive is they are modeled estimates. So there's, in this complex situation, there's no direct measurement. It's not like, oh, we have this gas well, we'll just put a meter next to it, and then we know how much emissions or leakage of methane comes out of that. So these are modeled estimates, okay? And this is never conveyed in commentary or reports about this in the general media. It's just someone makes an estimate or brings out a paper, and this estimate then is, shown as a sort of fact, like gravity. It's just there, and it's real, and it's a footnote, and it's reality. And so in previous estimates, as the authors said in the summary, overestimated methane leaks by making incorrect assumptions. So they had a certain assumption about the correlation between methane and ethane emissions from a gas well, and then they calculated their estimates from that. And so the authors now corrected for this bias and came to quite different conclusions compared to previous estimates. And so the good news is that errors can be corrected in estimates like this, in the studies. So it's not all lost with academia, but we have to be very careful with all the assertions that are made, especially when things are not as mature in studying, and particularly in the politically loaded areas. So the methane emissions of natural gas, of course, have enormous implications for US policy. So if the general framework is, okay, the government has a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector, then it's very important whether you have a 2% leakage rate or a 3% leakage rate in natural gas, because that totally changes the life cycle emissions of every process involved, every pipeline project, every natural gas power generation project, and so on and so forth.
So let me think. I mean, do you have strong reason to believe that this latest study has better methodology than earlier studies?
I think because they found a bias and corrected it. So it's, of course, I cannot, take my own samples. That's clear. But it's so it's a long-term established. The lead author is a long-term established NOAA employee, and most of the co-authors come from NOAA, and so I have no reason to believe that they are somehow biased towards industry interests.
It's interesting how with these studies, you never hear, at least in the public discussion of them, the confidence levels of them, including, okay, and part of that is there's not an indication of the methodology, and the assumption is usually that the methodology is some sort of perfect direct measurement. I mean, basically the
Yeah.
equivalent of you've got some water and you put a thermometer in it, and that gives you a really accurate reading. And it's just like, okay, well, they put a methane ometer somewhere, and then that perfectly got the amount of methane, and then they're just reading us the reading of it. So that just one thing that's good to know and hard to know is just what's the method by which some study was done, including when it's giving data, and how direct, like how close to direct perception is that versus how much is it, this is something that itself is quite speculative and where there may be wrong assumptions. And this comes up with things like average global temperatures, where you just tend to think, oh yeah, well, the Earth just has a thermometer and we took the temperature, and it's, oh well, no, that's actually really hard to do. And you have all these different weather stations, and it's a real effort to even get that kind of data. And then let alone you're talking about data from the past, and how do you get that? And yeah, I would just generally wish that there's more evidence about methodology, and it's a good reminder to us to, when we're talking about data, to be able to explain where it came from and what level of confidence we have in it and why.